good day to all of you who have joined us for our kickoff in the series for 2021 of the National Town Halls in partnership with the Insurance Information Institute's Resilience Accelerator initiative. I want to wait just a minute or two, Michelle and Casey, just to allow folks to be able to jump on and get registered in, and then we'll start going. So just give us a minute or two, and we'll jump in. As we're preparing for folks to join us, we will be recording the session and make obviously the presentation available for you all to review as well as to share with others in your networks. Again, as others are joining us, we're waiting just for a few minutes to allow folks to log in. So we'll be starting in another 2 minutes. Well, great. Let's go ahead and start, because I know everybody's got a busy schedule and we've got a full agenda of great information. Thank you again for joining us today in our kickoff for 2021 of the National Town Halls in partnership with the Insurance Information Institute and the Resilient Accelerator and Innovation Hub. We've got a pretty timely topic to go to today, since many of you are tracking a number of reports and articles that have literally come out in the past 7 days, not just global, but obviously focused on here in the United States. The number of disasters, risk mitigation, measurements, ratings, and rankings have become pretty significant in the online social media discussions. And so today we have an opportunity to hear from two leading experts that I want to have they'll be able to do a little bit better introduction, but Dr. Michelle Leonard with the Insurance Information Institute, leading the whole economic data science effort, as well as the Resilience Initiative, is joined today by Casey Zuzak at the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and specifically under the National Flood Insurance Program, and he'll explain a little bit more about his background and work. But today what we hope to do is start a way of curating and connecting significant tools, both from the public and the private sector, that help the insurance industry, investors, communities, practitioners, and most importantly, public and private sector leaders who are in charge of some aspect of resource allocation, help make better decisions with the tools that you're seeing available today and that we'll be continuing to present. So without further ado, I want to introduce Casey. Casey, give a little bit of your background, and then the forum is yours.
Fantastic, and thanks, Richard, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Casey Zuzak with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and within our agency, I sit within the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, which I think a lot of you guys have worked with Liz Ash before. She's in the Federal Insurance Directorate, which does a lot with the analytics and managing of the National Flood Insurance Program data and supporting floodplain managers. I sit in our Risk Management Directorate, which is side by side to the Federal Insurance Directorate. And what our directorate is tasked with is around defining risk associated with national flood or with floodplains and the flood hazard in general, mapping the floodplains through the FEMA risk map program. My team directly supports the A in the risk map program, which is the assessment portion. So within the natural hazards risk assessment program, we translate that hazard information into risk data that can be used to drive decisions across the organization. So we support softwares like FEMA's HAZIS model, which is FEMA's economic loss model that's often used and available for economic loss measurements for flood, both coastal and riverine, hurricanes, earthquakes, and tsunamis. Additionally, our team has produced the National Risk Index, which is a way for us to talk about the landscape of natural hazards, or to really create that first ever baseline of natural hazard risk. It allows for us to talk about a top-down pre-calculated indice to help community planners, to help mitigation officials understand what parts of their community have highest risk to hazards, and not just hazard themselves, but also what parts of their communities may have a lower resilience or a higher social vulnerability, which can drive the outcome of risk and change the impacts of disasters. The National Risk Index provides, like I said, that first pre-calculated risk index across the United States and the 50 states and Washington, D.C., and it allows us to quickly identify areas of potential high return on investment for mitigation projects. The NRI was developed with all free and nationally consistently available data. And it, like I said, it provides us the mechanism to not only talk about specific hazards like flood within the risk map program, but expand beyond that, because we know when we go to communities, they want to talk about more hazards than just flood. They want to talk about how to, what is their tornado risk, what is their hurricane risk, and how they can buy down their risk within their community. So if that's leveraging FEMA grants to support safe rooms, is it working with outreach components to talk to individuals so that they can work to buy down their risk to hazards? There's a lot of different applications out there. And this is really a starting point to have these conversations. The National Risk Index has been in development in some shape or another since 2016. And it wasn't developed in a silo. We wanted to break down those traditional barriers, and we brought in local and county and state government, tribal and territorial governments into the building of the NRI to make sure that we had the best available data. We also brought in academia. We brought in the nonprofit agency organizations and private industry as we built out the NRI to make sure that we had everyone's input, so that when we developed a product, it wasn't something that was just FEMA-centric, but it was something that the entire user community would use in the end. So we worked with our partners at the USGS, the U.S. Forest Service, NOAA, the Hurricane Center, academic institutes like the University of South Carolina, Arizona State, University of Colorado at Boulder, our partners at FEMA, within our contracting partners as well. So CDM Smith, ABS Group, Factor, and Atkins all supported the NRI development as well. To select the hazards, we only looked at natural hazards. We wanted all of the data in the NRI to be free and publicly available. When we expand from natural hazards, that wish quickly goes away. So we kept with natural hazards. And to find the 18 hazards in the NRI, we reviewed the 50 state mitigation plans. That tells us which hazards each state is interested in mitigating, or they have the highest impacts, generally have the highest impacts from. If the hazard was included in at least 50% of the mitigation plans, or is a regionally significant event like volcanoes, tsunamis, or hurricanes, we wanted to include it in the NRI as a hazard. So we worked with our partners at our federal partners to come up with nationally available hazard frequency and exposure data sets to support the hazards selected. It was also important for us to include social vulnerability and community resilience within the National Risk Index. We charged our social vulnerability and community resilience working group with first determining if we should include one or both factors, and second, when we include these, do we want to recreate an indice or build our own at FEMA or use something that's already available? And the working group ultimately chose that we needed to include both social vulnerability and community resilience. They measure very distinct things, where social vulnerability helps us understand which communities are going to be disproportionately impacted by disasters, and resilience helps us understand which communities have the ability to recover after an event with less outside support. For social vulnerability, we moved forward with the Social Vulnerability Index from the University of South Carolina. And for our resilient component, we moved forward with the Baseline Resilience Indicators for Communities, or BRIC Index, also from the University of South Carolina. See, there's a question, but I'm not sure how to read it. Do you want me to just address questions at the end or as we go, Richard?
No, keep on going. Keep on going.
Perfect. To determine risk, there's a lot of different ways out there. Everyone has their own flavor, and essentially everything boils down into understanding what's in the way of the hazard and how bad is the hazard. So the way we determined risk for the National Risk Index is we define it as the product of the expected annual loss, social vulnerability, and community resilience, where our expected annual loss component is defined as the exposure to the natural hazard, the frequency, and historic loss ratio. So breaking that down even further is we look at the frequency, or how often does the hazard occur, what's in the way of the hazard in terms of property value, people in terms of fatalities, and agriculture or agricultural value, and historic loss, or how bad have historic hazards been in that area. It helps us understand if every hurricane that makes landfall in one county is a very high loss-causing event, or if every lightning strike in Houston, only 1 out of every 50,000 lightning strikes in Houston causes an impact. So this is a snapshot of what we came up with. In the top column, or I guess in the first on the left side, you see our expected annual loss rating, or the real value or annualized dollar losses for all 18 hazards combined. In the right-hand column, you see our risk score, or what happens when we apply the social vulnerability and community resilience component. So does that expected annual loss score go up or down based upon the social equity within that community? On the bottom, or the top row is by census or counties. The bottom is by census tract. The darker the red, the higher the risk. The lower, or darker the blue, the lower the risk. This is what you see within our phase 1 application, which is available through FEMA.gov/NRI. And, it's pretty easy to navigate. We have these layers loaded. And as we roll out our full application this summer, users will have access to all 18 individual hazard layers. So be able to see the expected annual loss for the 18 hazards, as well as the risk ratings for those as well. The National Risk Index has a wide variety of stakeholders. We've talked about the use for local communities and individuals to help buy down their risks to natural hazards. The first step is understanding what parts of your community is at risk. FEMA offers other tools like FEMA's RAP tool, or Risk Resilience Analysis Preparedness tool, that allows you communities to drive down further to understand what specific infrastructure are exposed to the specific hazards. It can be used to help talk about building codes and target communities that are high risk, that are socially vulnerable and have a lower resilience. So we know increased codes and standards help save lives and help reduce disaster costs in the end for those communities. So by targeting outreach to those communities, we can work with them in adopting higher codes and standards. It can be used to inform long-term recovery efforts, just to name a few. We've worked closely with our FEMA mitigation planning program, which is often a pre-requirement for many of the grants FEMA offers on the mitigation side of the house, so that users are able to bring as much information in from the NRI into their risk assessment portion of a mitigation plan, so that other funding can be used to focus on defining mitigation actions and then advancing those actions further. And as I mentioned earlier, the National Risk Index, we did roll that out in November 2020, and it's available through FEMA.gov/NRI. Our full application, which is coming out this summer, is focused around taking the current experience and building in a lot of user feedback to make it more easy to navigate, providing a robust library of documentation, as well as additional data in terms of being able to visualize the 18 different hazard risk scores, as well as the expected annual loss. We have a reporting functionality that is built in. So when you click on a county, you can export a report that details all of the information for that county, census tract, or multiple counties or multiple census tracts. Additionally, we'll be doing a few small data updates surrounding the historic loss ratio. We were able to get data from 2017, 18, and 19 for all 18 hazards, so we'll incorporate that as well. We're also investigating a few other hazards where some updated data has become available since we released the first app. So I'll go ahead and pause there. That's the National Risk Index in 10 minutes. I'm always happy to answer any questions, either now at the end of the conversation or via our email address, which either reach out to myself or FEMA-NRI@FEMA.dhs.gov.
Great. If it's okay with the transition, I'll start. I'll take over here. Just going to check if I'm actually showing on the audience view. Fantastic. Well, first, Casey, thank you so much for this. I have a few things to say. The first is kind of a side note. I have finally mastered for those of you who know me, I finally mastered the ability to be in two places at the same time. Today I'm live with Casey, but I'm also pre-recorded on the resilience panel of our annual meeting, JIF, the Joint Industry Forum. So I'm feeling quite excited about that, and hopefully it won't get to my head, but etc. So Casey, this is pretty fantastic. You know, we've been working with a different group closely related to you at NFIP, and you may not know this, but we actually have an MOU with DHS as a whole to actually collaborate on these issues, and I saw our logo was not on there. So Liz, when I talk to you next, I hold you personally responsible, and I think you're on, for actually not making sure that we could contribute to Casey's research. Casey, there's a few things there that I think this is really meeting a need for the industry, for the media, and so forth. And there's a few areas that I'd like to hear you expand. And just process-wise, you all watching us, we're going to have a little exchange here, Casey and I, and then we'll take the Q&A. And today's really more of an intimate conversation. You know, we've had these big things with 5 or 6 people, so we actually have time today to really dive into the questions. But you know, Casey, can you tell me a bit about, you know, we're coming out with some comparable ratings, but they do something else, but in this area in a few weeks. But like when you all started to say we want to do these ratings, we want to have something out there, I'm sure you went through this kind of gap assessment, the way I call it, like what's out there, what's missing, and narrowly, and you've talked a bit about that, but it'd be very interesting if you could just focus briefly on what was missing and why is it that you focus on this? And then my follow-up to that, which you may want to go to right away, is going to be, what's the most exciting thing here for you as a researcher? Because, I've been working in this not as long as you all have been, but it's really exciting work. So it'd be very, what gets you going there, and what is it that you and your team have found exciting?
Yeah, so the exciting part first is it's just exciting to have the data out there and see people actually engaging and using the data. We've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into pulling the National Risk Index together over 5 to 6 years. And having the support from not only within FEMA, but all of our federal partners, and being able to work with them over the years to come up with a product that has been widely used is incredible. And seeing it out there is really exciting. This is something I've thought about for a long time. I have a background in hazards geography, and being able to tie and package everything together in a consumable way to help reduce the risk of natural hazards for, not only states, locals, but individuals is incredible. And I just love seeing that people are actually using it and seeing that we've put it out there, and just hearing how people are integrating the NRI, not only into their work, but just advancing the science in the community as a whole. And to address the gap part is, we don't often with it. So in FEMA, we have a lot of different programs that are surrounded by the mitigation planning program. And the first step of the planning process is to truly understand what risks exist. And then next is, how do we mitigate those? There's a lot of inconsistency in a lot of communities that don't have the ability to actually create robust risk assessments. And this gives them a starting point. It helps those disadvantaged communities to have that same building block, same starting point as every other community across the country. And it allows them to also focus some of the effort away from the mitigation or the risk assessment, but also onto understanding how they can advance mitigation projects, mitigation actions within their communities to really save infrastructure, save lives in response to these large-scale events that are growing over time.
Thank you. And by the way, I don't know who has control, Richard or Maggie, but from my view here, you're not seeing me. You're seeing, or Casey, you're seeing the images. And I'd like, even though if we go back to it later, I'd like us to be able to see Casey and myself, because it's just more engaging. Otherwise, we'll do a podcast. I won't have to do all of this little, takes a lot of time to make my face pretty in the morning. So
yeah, I wouldn't have to go find a collared shirt today.
Exactly, or even sweatpants or something. Okay, y'all. The one thing you've mentioned, Casey, was loss estimates, and it's really been surprising to me how much how there really isn't any sort of benchmark to actually about loss estimates. Early on, when I took this job a few years ago, I remember it was a bit embarrassing on my side because as an economist, I was looking at the loss estimates, and we were simply saying, well, there's so the physical loss, the property loss is, let's say, X, and we're just going to multiply it by 3, or we're going to take a fraction of GDP or city product and so forth, and that just doesn't make sense. And I remember coming up with looking at these different numbers and saying it doesn't make sense. And of course, then I was the one looking like a fool, because if you're coming to something you don't know well, you're saying that, well, do your homework first. Well, we have done our homework, and we are trying to come up with this, and we want to work with you on that. But can you talk a bit about kind of how you're approaching this, and what are the pluses and benefits about this?
Yeah, that was one of the initial challenges. Is this has never been benchmarked before. So we went out, and the only data available for true historic loss information is from the National Center for Environmental NCEI, National Center for Environmental Information. There we go. Used to be NCDC. They collect what's called storm data. They publish what's called storm data reports, which are a collection of historic loss information from each National Weather Service weather forecasting office. So what happens is they find there's an event in one of the Weather Service forecast areas, and they record it. They record the amount of damage that's published, usually in a newspaper somewhere, or through other means from the county or community, and they share that information with the storm data reports. And that often gives us an understanding of how bad the event is within an order of magnitude. So is it a $10,000 event? Is it a $10 million event? Is it a $10 billion event? So that information is recorded, down to the month, date, specific day, sometimes even down to the time, and it tells us the area. So it'd be like 2 miles northwest of Castle Rock. Then Arizona State takes the data and puts it into a user-friendly database and adds to it other information around fatalities, injuries, crop loss, indemnity. So they publish a robust database called SHIELDUS, or the Spatial Hazards Event Loss Database for the U.S., shieldus.org. So we have that database, and that's what drives our historic losses and historic loss ratio. And that's really the only historic loss data that's available. So we were able to bring that in and use Bayesian credibility theory to expand it a little bit to understand, is it a ratio that's nationally applicable for some areas? Is it a local issue? Is it something that is non-geographic? Like I said, all of the data are collected at the county level, and we know that hazards could care less about political boundaries. So we had to find a way to figure out, how do we break that down? So using the Bayesian credibility theory, we're able to do that.
Okay, this is fascinating, and we're going to talk a little bit more, you and I, and then we'll open up to the floor in a few minutes. So thanks for all for your questions out there. One of the things going back to early on here, I remember looking at the discrepancy in loss estimates between two different media sources. I think it was Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and it was about $3 billion. It was a hurricane in Florida. It was about $3 billion bucks, and I called the journalist and so forth. And this is great about the Institute, is that we actually can reach out to folks. And we found out that the discrepancy was most likely due to military asset that had been destroyed, planes specifically, which, $300-400 million planes sometimes. So I'm just wondering how you take into account government property. And if you think of an FIP, there's government, there's religious, and so forth. But government, military, and from an insurance standpoint, it's very interesting for us because, of course, some of these assets are self-insured. Government, for example, most of the time is self-insured. It's an area actually of conversation. But how are you looking at that? And what do you think is kind of the right way? There's no such thing as the right way. But what do you think would be the easiest way for communicating, especially on the media side and the public?
It's incredible. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
It's incredibly challenging. I mean, we've not figured that out as a community. When we see a reported loss, it's taken as that's the loss, and that's what's reported up through NCEI. And those are the data that we ultimately use because that's the authoritative national data set. I think there's also room in understanding, is it better to look at historic losses to understand, what could happen, or is it better to model losses? Like earthquake. I always describe earthquake as the perfect hazard because USGS has figured everything out about earthquakes. They know where they happen. Yeah. They know how often they happen. We have an amazing geological record that records every earthquake, and it's easy to understand. We also can have a good understanding of how buildings react to earthquakes and how different building constructions and materials. So we have robust modeling capabilities around earthquakes, and that's the data that we brought in for the earthquake hazard. FEMA, it's called FEMA Publication 366, which is an annualized earthquake loss number that's published at the census tract for every county, and it's updated on the same timeline as the USGS updates their earthquake maps. So for that, we are able to capture potential losses around government facilities, around military installations, around large-scale public infrastructure, religious buildings. One of the challenges there is sometimes we want to use local parcel data, and within the city of Salt Lake, the Mormon church there has a large number of high-value residential buildings that sometimes are incorporated into databases for tax reasons, other times not because they're a religious facility. So that's just some challenges that we work through as a community. And I wish I could say we always have perfect data every time and everywhere, but unfortunately that's not always the case.
Well, perfect data is something we will ever be thriving towards. That makes us data scientists a very fully employed profession. So we like that. It's interesting. You mentioned Salt Lake City, but New York City, folks from the area know we always hear the Catholic Church, for example, a religious organization, of course, is one of the biggest landowners, Columbia University, NYU. So those they're not just at the margins. For those of you who are listening, these sometimes are massive, or scale-wise can change things. And in areas such as Florida, you have military government assets that can actually make a huge difference as well. In Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. One of the areas, Casey, that we'll be able, you and I and the rest of the team over there to collaborate more is actually for the Institute to play a role in facilitating the emergence of these national benchmarks. And I personally feel, and we as the Institutes also very much believe that it's going to be key to actually have some sort of consensus. And I know our friends in the media will very much appreciate that. And I think consumers will benefit from that because, again, we'll be able to convey a better sense. And as you said, the earthquakes are so much ahead of everything, thankfully, for earthquakes. But on the flood side and the hurricane side, tornadoes and so forth, we're not there yet. The first question that I want to look at is actually from a friend of ours in attendance at RMS, and I hope that was not a problem mentioning it. I should not maybe on that, but I'm going to follow it by a compliment, and they are one of the most amazing organizations out there that looks into these issues of data. And the question is actually very close to the work we're doing right now in terms of reporting losses in the context of overall data, public data, let's say NFIP public flood data, and private sector flood data. And there are many organizations on the private sector side that are looking at aggregating and assembling private loss data. We are actually at the Institute leading an initiative in the context of private water damage data to complement the fantastic work that has been done by your sister team at NFIP. So, we still find to this day that there is, and let's just focus on flood maybe as a start, and then you can provide more extended, because obviously I keep going back to flood because that's what we're focusing the most right now, but we plan on extending to wildfires and the other types of risk. And I do want to keep stressing to the audience, of course, as you've done very well, Casey, that this is about all risk and cross risk. I don't want to confuse folks here by focusing on that. But could you speak a bit to this question about how much you've been able to leverage private insurance data and maybe where we can go together, working together? My message has been to our members who represent a majority of P&C companies is how do we do our part of this job, especially after NFIP has responded to us, the industry, in providing some data. We want to make our contribution and we want to reciprocate. So it'd be very interesting if you could, again, one, speak to what is private, what is public in terms of the data sources, where it comes from. You've done a good job about that, but just want to maybe more specifically with regards to insurance data, and then where do we go from here?
So the more data, the better. I think as a data nerd, we all agree that the more data out there, the better. It allows for us to make better long-term decisions. Within the National Risk Index, we leverage data sets from NOAA, from the National Hurricane Center, from the USGS and FEMA to help understand what areas are most at risk for flooding. We know we're not capturing everything, but it's a start. Companies like, I can't think of the company that just released the flood risk score. Having that extra information out there benefits everyone. It benefits everyone in the end because it's carrying on that conversation. So the more information, the better. FEMA's taken, and the federal insurance director, I don't know if Liz is on, if she wants to talk about this more, but they've taken steps on, getting data out there to individuals so that they can help understand the risk. And, we're always happy to bring in more data into the NRI to help make better decisions on our end. And the more data, the more opportunities for improvement we have with the NRI.
I'm assuming you might have been referring to true flood risk. Was that the one you referred to?
From First Street Foundation.
First Street,
it was from First Street Foundation.
Yes.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, we actually connected with the folks there a few weeks ago, and I was super excited because their work is fantastic. And I was quite impressed with the quality of the work, and we'll try to showcase them probably in the coming months in one of these. Which one of these different perils do you feel, or have you found, where are we the furthest in terms of these benchmarks, this data, and where are we the least further? Hopefully I'm making sense here.
So I think it's all hazards are not created equally, and not everyone captures data equally. We know the large-scale, high-risk hazards that produce the most losses generally have the best data available. Hazards like landslide and volcano, it's incredibly challenging because with landslides, the period of record for a national landslide database is only 10 years. That's the shortest period of record that we have within the NRI. And it's just, unfortunately, that's where it's at. The risk science for landslide hazards is advancing pretty quickly. There's a lot of really good research that's going into understanding landslide risk, frequency, and historic losses. And that's one of the first updates that we're planning to make, is adding 3 more years to the database. 3 years doesn't sound like a lot, but when you go from 10 to 13 years, that's a huge increase in data. So we're really excited for that. Hazards like flood. I think we've talked a lot about coastal. FEMA's mapped almost all of the coast. We've reached our 80% in-view metrics within the risk map program. So we've done a really good job of having validated maps, and 80% of our maps are valid based upon the metrics. But it's also we need to start talking about what does the pluvial flood risk, what about the risk in areas we haven't mapped yet? And those are all areas that we're building in over time. So I think as we get more fidelity in those areas, then we gain more information from the hazard risk side as well. And like I said, earthquake is the perfect hazard. So I think we have a ton of really good information about earthquakes.
Have you found, and I asked this question last week to another group, have you found that, actually it's the question I'm asking right now on the other place where I am at this time, but have you found that the ability of academia to participate, to contribute, I mean, how do we, again, it's one of our roles at the Triple-I to facilitate, because we're at the intersection of academia, of the private sector and the regulators and so forth. I'm just wondering, what are the areas that you found in working with some of the universities, where has it been easy? Where could it be even better in that regard? And not only with academia, but also with the private sector. And how can we explore some solutions there? If we were to say, how do we work together this year, and what else would be some of the goals that you'd like, the industry to be able to facilitate further, to make the data available? Is it the data itself? Is it the making it more structured? I mean, we all know how long it takes to structure data. Is it having standards within the data? We've talked a bit about that, about how we report with classified taxonomies. Could be something that is very helpful, etc.
One thing great about working with academia is that they love seeing their research put into action. So by understanding what's out there from the academic research side, and having the more insight we have into that, the more we can understand how we can integrate that into FEMA public programs and policy. And I think within our organization, we're moving. We have a lot more of a push to integrate that over time, and I think there's a lot of great research out there that we really do need to look at. And I think the NRI did a really good job of tying what information is out there from a research perspective from a private sector perspective and from a government perspective, and being able to tie it into one application tool for users to be able to consume.
Now, the one of the things that's interesting is how you've worked with the private sector in some of these areas. And my understanding of your team and the way the other team put together the NFIP flood data is that you did that a lot internally. Certainly on the other side, I'm just wondering if that was the same thing. And again, with a sense of how the private sector could help, either on a pure collaboration, our MOU, for example. So I would call it a nonprofit kind of approach to it. And of course, then there are all the vendors that the government would work with. But I'm just wondering if you did the work mostly internally, or if there was some external component to it.
We did a lot of the initial research and building of the National Risk Index internally, but as it grew in scope, and we then brought in our contracting partners and vendors to complete the NRI and roll it out. So that was a large part of our private sector engagement. We also, when we had working groups focused around hazard data to define which data sets we should include. We had working groups around social vulnerability and community resilience, and we had working groups around how to display the information and make it consumable by the public. And we had private sector engagement on all three working groups as well.
I have a question that was submitted ahead of time that I want to bring up, dealing with the intra-agency collaboration. So if you could speak a bit about the role that this new national benchmark across these multi-perils will actually play in facilitating the dialogue by creating a benchmark again across the agencies. So we've mentioned earthquakes, of course, so the different earthquake authorities at the state level, and California Earthquake Authority being one, of course, the main ones. Just wondering, but also the federal government, wondering if you could speak a bit about, from a more technical standpoint, how this will be used and areas for further collaboration.
The National Risk Index is the starting point for the collaboration. We worked closely with our partners at, I think it was upwards of 80 SMEs from the private sector, nonprofits, and other federal partners in coming up with the National Risk Index. So we leveraged groups from NCD or NCEI, from the USGS, earthquake program, the landslide program, the NOAA Storms Prediction Center, the Hurricane Center, in these data sets. So not only did we have their vested interest in looking at how we're interpreting the data, but we also had their input on how we're visualizing the data. And did the way we're capturing the risk index look, is that right? Are we missing things? So by having their buy-in, we're facilitating partnerships down the road and starting to build these relationships with other organizations that may have been there in the past. Some are formalized, some are not fully formalized, but we're opening doors between FEMA and our partners so that we can start talking about how we can reduce risk in the long term.
No, in the last few minutes we have, and yes, you all, this will be one of those that lasts our good 1 hour. We will actually, for once, be sticking to our time, except if there are more questions coming in, but we'll have more opportunities to continue this. But Casey, could you talk a bit about where you want to go with the team, with your colleagues? What are some of the exciting places you're going to go this year, and some of the places that where academia, folks in our audience, academia, state regulators, accelerators, like the one that we're doing now in conjunction with Richard. What are those places that, what are the benchmarks for this year, and how are there specific areas that folks in the audience could actually reach out and contribute to, especially? This is the time that you ask the audience to do something for you.
Our first part is really getting the full application out to users. We released it in 2 phases because we had the data ready, and we're still working on finalizing the full application, and we wanted to get the data out to the community as soon as possible. There's a lot of uses for the data, and we'd love to hear those uses and how different people are looking to integrate the National Risk Index into their programs, into their workflows, how they see they could use the index, and anything that they would see as a recommendation or an enhancement. We're always open to hearing those. we have goals around, like I said, increasing the historic hazard loss ratio or data. So we have 3 years of data that we want to bring in for there. We want to increase our period of record for our landslide hazard. Coming up, we know we have more information around coastal flooding that we want to bring in to the NRI. We want to work with our partners in risk rating to hopefully bring in some of their information as well. They've created a robust data set that, I think the uses are endless in the hazard risk and understanding hazard risk. And we also want to focus on the 2020 census data updates. We all know that, that data should be coming in the near term. And it's important for us to not only update that from understanding who's in the way of the hazards, but, what is the dollar value? How does that change social vulnerability and community resilience over time? And in the long term, it really helps us to understand how the risk environment across the United States is changing. We know risk isn't static. So this gives us that first benchmark in understanding, potential directions of risk in different areas. Our communities that we're investing money in to reduce risk, are they buying down their risk, or has it not changed? So that's all things that we're interested in.
Great. I could go on and on with these more technical data questions and so forth, but I'm going to pass to Richard. And for the benefit of time, I'll say thank you so much, Casey, to you and your team and your colleagues for the work you've done. Myself, my colleagues, our friends in the audience, that's going to make a huge difference for us. It's very helpful, and you're really helping move the industry. And it's a great example of public-private partnership, what you're putting there. And that's the best time to pass over to Richard, because, of course, Richard's whole focus these days with these webinars is how to facilitate these public-private partnerships and all of that. Richard, back to you.
Well,
and
Michelle,
thank you,
Michelle. Michelle, we've got a couple of questions for you, but I want to leverage what you just played off on, Casey. And I think this whole of government approach that's really been both necessary and encouraged, whether it's the U.S. Chamber or others, I think this begins to serve as one of those key platforms for bringing the whole of government, because, as you know, Casey, better than I would, while FEMA has the lead, you've got HUD with their CDBG program. EPA is beginning to move down this path. So the other agencies and departments. Tell us just a little bit about what you sense, or kind of what is the next schedule, so to speak, of bringing the whole of government together around these tools? Because I think there's some things that Michelle and I and others have been thinking about that may be a nice way to co-host something. But Casey, give me your sense of what's the next step for the whole of government at this point.
Like I said, the National Risk Index is that starting point for these conversations. It helps us understand where we have differences in hazard risk, not only in terms of where we see the highest frequencies and highest exposures, but how risk changes based upon from communities looking at social vulnerability, social equity, and community resilience. The next step is figuring out how we make those communities more resilient. And that's where partners like the EPA, like HUD and CBDG, where we can work through our mitigation flagship leadership group, the MITFLAG, to really bring some of these groups together in an intergovernmental way to help understand how we can, support grant applications and help communities come up with matches to buy down their risk. How we can, advance large-scale projects, to reduce risk. The Wasatch Front in Utah has a high earthquake risk, and it has a high unreinforced masonry building count. Those buildings are often schools. They're multifamily residents. So what can we do to reinforce those buildings and, mitigate those structures so that we can reduce losses in the long run? And FEMA isn't the only only group that has funds available to support projects like that.
Right.
We can work with our partners at, like you've mentioned, HUD and US, HUD and EPA. But there's a whole other group of partners out there, and it's how do we align funds to support projects like that? And how do we identify ways to advance large-scale projects?
Casey, let me play off of that, because I think, again, this is never easy. Having lived in Washington for 27 years and run a couple of federal agencies, this is never easy. And I not only commend you and your patients and the team and all that have been working on it. The evidence, frankly, of my 27 years of living in D.C. is I have no more hair. But the fact is that I sense, and this is really a question, not a statement, but I'll use it as a statement, the tool that you all have developed and that others in the private sector have developed, I think is actually beginning to pinpoint resource allocation. Where do we need to put resources, target those resources, and most importantly, leverage more than just federal or government resources? So one, I want to pose to both you and Michelle how we begin to use these tools from a resource allocation. And then my second question is something that I'll speak openly, and that is that when we started looking at the CDBG MIT money, all right, which is primarily coming from a housing department, but still has urban development as a piece of it, all right? We started looking at the overlays of watersheds, for instance, where the low to moderate income neighborhoods are, all right? Because obviously, when you're downstream of a storm and you're in a low and moderate income neighborhood, the peril and disaster impact is exponential. So one of the things that we found was that it was counterproductive in how CDBG MIT money and FEMA money were not aligning. So I think, one, my question is how do we begin to really use these tools for resource allocation? And second, I think that this does begin to find a way to align different policies, different programs to maximize the value of resources. Michelle? Casey?
I'll take this one first, and also Casey, I think I'm going to spare you here a bit because we understand your role within the organization, and Richard operates at a very high level, and you may want to go straight to the secretary there on that question. But the person is most likely listening, so he's able to get that through there. The ability to cooperate is so important. I mean, we're still wrestling in the private sector, even at the institutes, and the institute no S, and at the institutes with an S, on the role that we can do. Where do we invest our resources? Is it in data aggregation? Is it money we put ourselves, and we go to our members and we get that? Is it looking for government funding? We're a nonprofit, for example, but we have members that are willing and that have put resources behind this. There's the Pew Foundation, the Pew Trust, for example, are looking right now at an initiative that specifically on private flood. It's very important, and that we aim to support as well. So I feel that there is a great need for being able to connect the researchers and the folks at the more senior level, and that's very much what we're trying to do here. I'm more of a technical guy and so forth, and Richard is of course more of a senior policy and DC type. I guess maybe so that will be my answer, that we want to get better at it, Richard, by these forum that we're convening, and we want to explore different ways. But what I'd like to put out there to our audience and Casey and Liz and so forth. Sorry, Liz, we keep going back to you. Is what is the best way for us in the private sector, in the nonprofit private sector, in the trade association, to support these things. And I'd like to suggest, Casey, that there's no answer for that right now here, but certainly that as we continue the conversation and expand now with your group, what I joked about, we weren't there on that list of logos, but we want to be there, what's the best way for us to be there, and so forth. And then, I'm going to let you go from your side, and I kind of hinted at it before, but I'll let you answer it from your side in the way that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, and like you said, I still have all my hair, and that may be because I'm in Denver, not DC. Not sure yet, but I think we also need to understand how we can fund projects on the FEMA end, not only through FEMA and our partner grant programs, but also understanding what non-traditional ways exist. There's been a lot of looking into those pieces as well. As there's how can we work with the private industry? How can we work with communities on financing different projects and large scale projects? And I think that there's a lot of interest down that path as well. We know that we have a lot to bring to the table, and I think our new BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, is a huge step in that direction, especially with some of these large-scale disaster years that we've had. There's a lot of funds that have the potential to be allocated through the BRIC program, which it's a huge step in the right direction towards increasing resilience.
And one thing I want to, that's going to be my last comment, is, Casey, you may not have been there yet, but we have what we call our Resilience Hub, which is the web-based version, not the facilitator, the accelerator that Richard is leading. And we have maps, and we visualize take-up rates, for example, and FIP take-up rates. We'd really like to be able to work with you on bringing some of this. And this is a tool that consumers see a lot, that the media goes to. One of the most amazing things about the Institute is that when you put a question about insurance, Google, in 80% of the cases, puts us at the top or in the top 3. So we're Wikipedia almost like. So that's a huge asset that we like to make available to our partners and to visualize. And sometimes just by having articles, blogs, and then sending them directly to your relevant resources website, sometimes by working together to give a more accessible version of what's out there. So we look forward to doing our part on that over the next few months.
Hey, Michel, let me throw one other observation and question, and not that I was trying to put Casey in a box in regards to resource allocation, but I do again want to emphasize that data and the data science that you, Casey, and your team and Michel are really already having an impact on resource allocation. It's really already having the ability for real estate developers, for infrastructure decision makers to begin to take a look at where they should or shouldn't place their resources. But I would be remiss in also pointing out that we have a couple of folks that are tied in, Michel, as you know, with our initiative that represent the public water utilities across the country, who often are the ones that are, to some degree, a part of the first responders, because getting, drinkable water for citizens back up, making sure, the fire departments have water and all. So I think this becomes also relevant, Casey, again, the incredible work that you all are doing in providing that data, and the social impact includes this recognition as well that these public water utilities are a part of the resilience networks and really are beginning to look at pre-disaster risk mitigation. So I just wanted to reemphasize that, there's the private sector piece of this, but there are just as many folks on the public sector side, Casey, as y'all know, that look to these kinds of tools as being critical. So thank you for, that dynamic. All right. With that said, I know that we could possibly just keep on going. There's a number of good questions that remain. Michel and Casey, as y'all know, we've recorded this. It'll be up on various sites and be able to be shared. I think also the opportunity to share the presentation and then Michel and Casey, your contact information is critical, because I'm sure there's a lot of follow-up questions or some ideas on where we really move this from here's what's on the screen to how, like you said, Casey, how do we help communities become more resilient? And that's the ultimate impact, if I'm saying it correctly. Any last quick observations, Casey and Michelle, before we let folks?
No, we're on time. I'm so excited about being on time.
This is the first time I've ever been on time for anything in my life, so thank you.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you both, and thank you to the audience.